The version of you that finally feels like yourself will disappoint almost everyone who loved the version that came before it. Nobody warns you about this part. Every story about self-discovery promises relief, clarity, a homecoming. Almost none of them mention that the homecoming has a cost, and the cost is usually paid by the people who built their relationship with you around the person you were before you knew who you actually were. Carl Jung spent his entire working life trying to describe what actually happens in this process, and he was careful, in a way most modern self-help language isn't, to distinguish it from simple self-esteem or confidence. Discovering who you are is not the same as feeling good about yourself. It is not a mood. It is closer to an excavation, a long, often uncomfortable process of separating the self you actually are from the self you were trained, rewarded, and occasionally punished into becoming. Jung called this process individuation, and he considered it the central task of a human life, not because it makes you happier in any simple sense, though it often eventually does, but because the alternative, remaining unindividuated, means living out someone else's version of you indefinitely, mistaking it for your own the entire time. To understand why this is so disorienting when it finally happens, you have to understand what Jung meant by the persona, the mask constructed early in life to navigate the social world successfully. The persona is not fake exactly. It is more like a uniform, assembled from whatever qualities were rewarded by your particular family, your particular culture, your particular set of early relationships. A child praised only for achievement builds a persona organized around achievement. A child praised only for being agreeable builds a persona organized around agreeableness. The persona works. That's precisely the problem. It works well enough, for long enough, that most people never have any reason to question whether it's actually them, or simply the most efficient adaptation available at the time it was built. The trouble is that a persona, however functional, is not the same thing as a self. It is a costume that fits so well you eventually forget you're wearing it, and the moment you start to notice the seams, usually somewhere in adulthood, often triggered by a loss, a disappointment, or simply an accumulating exhaustion with performing a role that no longer feels sustainable, the entire structure you've built, your identity and your relationships around, starts to feel questionable in a way that is genuinely frightening. This is not a crisis of low self-esteem. It is often the opposite, a crisis triggered by finally having enough stability and safety to notice that the self being maintained doesn't quite match the self underneath it. Jung believed that beneath the persona lies something he called the self, capitalized deliberately to distinguish it from the ordinary ego, the small, conscious I that manages daily decisions. The self, in Jung's framework, is the total, integrated psyche, including everything the persona excluded, the disowned shadow material, the suppressed desires, the abandoned talents, the discarded parts of you that were inconvenient for whoever needed you to be a certain way. Individuation is the long process of bringing the ego into relationship with this larger self, not replacing one with the other, but expanding the ego's awareness until it can finally hold more of what was actually always there. This explains something that confuses many people when they first begin this process seriously. They expect self-discovery to feel like finding something new, an exciting revelation about who they secretly are. More often, it feels like grief, because what's actually being discovered is not new information but old information that was deliberately buried, sometimes decades earlier. And grief is the natural response to finally acknowledging how much time was spent living around a self rather than living as one. You are not meeting a stranger when you do this work. You are meeting someone you already knew and had to forget in order to survive an earlier version of your life. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, because the abstraction alone doesn't capture the disorientation involved. A person who has spent 20 years building a career around a talent that was praised early, mathematics, say, or a particular kind of reliability, may discover, somewhere in their late 30s or 40s, a persistent, quiet dissatisfaction that no external success seems able to touch. This dissatisfaction is often misread as burnout, or as needing a vacation, or as simple midlife restlessness, and sometimes it is exactly that. But often, examined honestly, it traces back to a talent or an interest that was present all along, visible even in childhood, and that was quietly set aside because it wasn't the thing that earned praise, wasn't practical, wasn't what the family or the culture around them valued. The mathematics was real. It simply wasn't the whole picture, and the part left out doesn't disappear just because it was never developed. It waits, the way anything unintegrated waits, generating exactly the kind of low, persistent dissatisfaction that eventually forces the question nobody wanted to ask directly: who would I actually be if I stopped organizing my life around what was rewarded and started organizing it around what was actually true? There is a specific difficulty in even beginning to ask this question honestly, because the persona, by design, is extremely good at generating plausible reasons not to examine itself. It will tell you the dissatisfaction is temporary. It will tell you that everyone feels this way sometimes, that wanting more is simply immaturity, that the responsible thing is to keep going exactly as you have been. Some of this advice is even occasionally correct, which is precisely what makes the persona's defense so effective. It doesn't need to be right every time. It only needs to be plausible enough, often enough, to keep the deeper question from ever being asked with any real seriousness. Jung considered this one of the persona's most underappreciated functions, not simply presenting a face to the world, but actively defending itself against the ego's own curiosity, treating any serious inquiry into what lies beneath it as a threat to be managed rather than a question to be answered. This is where the disappointment of other people becomes almost unavoidable, and it's worth naming clearly rather than softening, because most descriptions of this process understate how real the cost can be. The people closest to you built their relationship with you, often over years or decades, around the persona you were wearing when they met you. A parent who has always related to you as reliable, as the one who doesn't cause problems, as the family's steady center, experiences your individuation, your slow move toward a more honest and complete version of yourself, as a kind of loss, even when what you're moving toward is objectively healthier. You have not become worse. You have become different from the specific shape they built their expectations around. And difference, however positive in the abstract, registers to anyone invested in the old shape as something to grieve. Jung would have said this reaction is not usually malicious. It is simply what happens when a system, a family, a marriage, a friendship organizes itself around a fixed set of roles, and one member of that system begins operating from a genuinely different, more integrated place. The system resists, not out of cruelty, but because systems are built for stability, and stability, by definition, resists change. Even change that everyone involved would agree, in the abstract, is good. This is why individuation so often produces friction in exactly the relationships that were previously the most comfortable, precisely because comfort, in those relationships, frequently depended on you staying recognizable in a way that no longer fits who you're actually becoming. There is a particular kind of loneliness that accompanies this stage of the process, and it deserves honest description rather than the vague, inspirational language usually applied to it. It is not the loneliness of having no one around. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who knew a version of you that no longer quite exists, and not yet having built relationships that know the version currently emerging. This gap between the self you're leaving behind and the community that hasn't yet formed around the self you're becoming can last considerably longer than people expect, and it is one of the primary reasons individuation is so often abandoned partway through. Not because the insight wasn't real, but because the accompanying isolation felt unbearable enough that returning to the old persona, however unsatisfying, seemed preferable to sustaining the discomfort of the transition. There is a particular version of this loneliness worth naming separately, because it involves not other people, but your own relationship with time. Individuation tends to unsettle a person's sense of their own history, because memories that once seemed straightforward, a happy childhood, a supportive family, a fulfilling early career, often require re-examination in light of what's being discovered underneath the persona. This does not necessarily mean the earlier story was false. It means it was incomplete, told from the perspective of the persona rather than the whole self, and revisiting it honestly can feel, for a period, like losing a coherent narrative of your own life, without yet having a new one solid enough to replace it. This particular disorientation, the sense of not quite knowing your own story anymore, is uncomfortable enough that many people quietly abandon the work specifically to avoid it, preferring an incomplete but coherent history to an honest but temporarily fragmented one. Jung was direct about the fact that this process cannot be rushed by will alone, and cannot be completed through insight alone either. Understanding intellectually that you have been living inside a persona does not, by itself, dissolve the persona. The ego resists its own expansion the same way any established structure resists disruption, generating doubt, generating excuses, generating 100 reasonable-sounding justifications for returning to the familiar shape, rather than continuing to tolerate the discomfort of becoming something less familiar, even to yourself. This resistance is not weakness, it is simply the psyche's natural conservatism, the same mechanism that makes any deep change difficult, regardless of how clearly the change is understood in principle. What actually moves the process forward, in Jung's account, is not more understanding but more contact, direct, repeated encounter with the material that the persona was built to avoid. This often happens through what Jung called active imagination, deliberately engaging with dreams, fantasies, and unbidden images, rather than dismissing them as noise, treating them as genuine communications from a part of the psyche that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, for the ego to finally start listening. It also happens through simpler, more embodied practices, noticing what genuinely interests you apart from what you've been trained to find interesting, noticing what you find yourself avoiding, and asking honestly why. Noticing the specific moments when you feel most like a performance and least like a person, and treating those moments as data rather than as something to immediately smooth over. There is a particular signpost worth naming directly, because it shows up with remarkable consistency across people doing this work seriously, and it involves anger. Not dramatic anger, necessarily, but a quiet, persistent irritation that surfaces around specific, seemingly small situations. Being asked to perform a role you're tired of, being praised for a quality that no longer feels like the most important thing about you, being expected to prioritize something that used to matter and increasingly doesn't. This irritation is often the clearest available signal that the persona and the emerging self have started to diverge, because anger, in Jung's framework, is frequently the shadow's most direct communication, indicating a boundary that needs to be drawn between who you're expected to be and who you're actually becoming. There is a second, quieter signpost that deserves equal attention, and it involves fatigue rather than anger. A specific, recognizable exhaustion tends to accompany the maintenance of a persona that has drifted too far from the self underneath it. A tiredness that doesn't respond to rest the way ordinary physical tiredness does, because it isn't actually physical in origin. It is the cost of constant, largely unconscious translation, taking whatever the self actually wants to express and converting it, in real time, into whatever the persona considers acceptable to show. This translation work is exhausting, precisely because it never stops, running in the background of every interaction, every decision, every unremarkable Tuesday. And its cumulative weight is very often what people are actually describing when they say they feel tired of their own life, without being able to point to any single cause. There is a third signpost, less commonly discussed, that involves a shift in what a person finds themselves envying. Early in life, envy tends to attach to whatever the persona has been trained to value: other people's visible success, their status, their approval from others. As individuation progresses, envy often shifts targets in a way that feels strange the first time it's noticed, moving toward people who seem simply at ease with themselves. unremarkable in conventional terms, but visibly unbothered by the performance most people are still maintaining. This shift in the object of envy is itself a useful marker of the process underway, because it indicates the self beginning to recognize what it actually wants: ease, integration, coherence, rather than continuing to chase whatever the old persona was trained to chase. The relationship most affected by this shift is often, somewhat counterintuitively, not a romantic partnership but a family relationship, particularly with parents, because parents, more than almost anyone else, tend to have the deepest investment in a version of you that was formed under their direct influence. A parent who raised a child to be careful, dutiful, and unremarkable in their ambitions may respond to that child's later individuation, their growing willingness to take risks, to disagree openly, to want things loudly, with something that looks like disapproval but is more accurately described as disorientation, a parent grieving the loss of a familiar dynamic, even while the underlying change is something they might, in the abstract, claim to want for their child. This disorientation can last a long time, and it rarely resolves through argument or persuasion. It resolves, if it resolves at all, through the parent, slowly, gradually, coming to know the new version of you well enough that a new, updated relationship becomes possible, built on the actual current person rather than on the earlier, more convenient version. It is worth being honest that not every relationship survives this process intact, and Jung did not pretend otherwise. Some relationships were built so entirely around the old persona that there is, in fact, very little left to hold them together once that persona is set down. This is genuinely painful, and no amount of psychological framework makes the grief of losing a friendship or straining a family relationship feel smaller than it is. But Jung would have argued that a relationship maintained only by continuing to perform a false version of yourself is not actually a relationship with you at all. It is a relationship with the persona, and mourning its loss, while real, is different from mourning the loss of an authentic connection, because an authentic connection with someone else was never actually what was being sustained. There is a particular kind of relationship that survives this process unusually well, and it's worth naming because it offers a useful contrast to the ones that don't. Relationships built, even partially, on genuine curiosity about the other person, rather than on the reliable performance of a fixed role, tend to have far more flexibility to absorb this kind of change. A friend who has always been interested in what you actually think, rather than simply comfortable with what you've always said, tends to greet a shifting version of you with interest rather than alarm, because the friendship was never actually dependent on you staying the same in the first place. This suggests something worth considering deliberately as this work continues, that the relationships most worth protecting through this transition are often not the ones that have lasted longest, but the ones that have shown the most genuine curiosity about you as an evolving person, rather than a fixed and reliable feature of someone else's life. There is also a professional dimension to this shift that deserves separate mention, because careers, more than almost any other domain, tend to be built directly on top of a persona rather than beside it. A career chosen to satisfy a parent's expectations, or to prove a point to an earlier version of yourself, or simply because it was the most available option at a formative moment, can become one of the most difficult structures to examine honestly, precisely because so much practical machinery, income, identity, years of accumulated expertise depends on not questioning it too closely. This is why individuation so often triggers a career crisis somewhere in its middle stages, not because the career itself was necessarily wrong, but because the reasons it was chosen may not survive contact with a more honest accounting of what the self actually values now. Some people, examined this closely, discover their career was always a genuine expression of who they are, simply obscured by persona-driven motivations layered on top of it. Others discover a harder truth, that the career was never really theirs to begin with, and that untangling a life built around it requires a kind of practical courage that goes well beyond the internal work alone. What emerges on the other side of this process, when it's allowed to continue far enough, is not a dramatically different personality in most cases. Jung was clear that individuation does not usually produce a complete transformation into someone unrecognizable. It produces, instead, a considerably more integrated version of the same person, someone whose visible behavior finally matches their internal experience more closely than it did before. Someone who no longer needs to expend enormous, largely unconscious energy, maintaining a gap between what they show and what they actually feel. This integration, more than any specific external change, is usually what people mean when they describe finally feeling like themselves, not a new personality, but the considerable relief of no longer needing to manage the distance between two selves that used to require constant, exhausting translation. There is a specific quality to decisions made from this more integrated place, and it's worth naming because it explains why individuated people often appear, from the outside, unusually calm, even in genuinely difficult circumstances. A decision made primarily to satisfy an old persona, to maintain approval, to avoid disappointing someone invested in an outdated version of you, tends to carry a particular kind of anxious static, because some part of the psyche knows, even if only vaguely, that the decision doesn't reflect what's actually true underneath. A decision made from a more integrated place carries less of that static, not because the decision is necessarily easier, but because it isn't fighting an internal war between the persona's requirements and the self's actual priorities. This doesn't mean individuated people never doubt themselves. It means their doubt tends to be about the decision itself, rather than about a deeper, unexamined conflict over which version of themselves gets to make it. There is also a shift, often noticed only in retrospect, in how a person relates to other people's opinions of them. Someone still operating primarily from the persona tends to experience criticism, even mild criticism, as a kind of structural threat, because the persona's entire function depends on maintaining a specific, approved image, and any crack in that image feels disproportionately dangerous. A more integrated person can hear the same criticism and simply weigh it, agreeing where it's accurate, setting it aside where it isn't, without the reaction consuming disproportionate emotional resources either way. This is not the same as no longer caring what others think, which would itself be a kind of imbalance. It is closer to caring appropriately, in proportion to the actual relationship and the actual content of what's being said, rather than reflexively, out of a persona's need to remain intact at all costs. Jung also believed that individuation was never fully complete, and this matters because it prevents the process from being misunderstood as a destination with a finish line. New material continues to surface throughout a life. New complexes form around new experiences, and the work of integration continues, in smaller and smaller cycles. For as long as a person remains psychologically alive and curious about themselves, this is not a discouraging fact. It means the discomfort of this particular season, the disorientation, the friction with people who knew an earlier version of you, the loneliness of the gap between who you were and who you're becoming, is not a permanent condition. It is a season, and seasons, by their nature, pass, even while new ones eventually begin. There is a final piece of this worth sitting with, because it's the part most self-discovery narratives skip in favor of a tidier ending. Becoming who you actually are does not guarantee that your life becomes easier, more successful, or more comfortable by any conventional measure. It sometimes does. Just as often, it means giving up specific comforts, specific relationships, specific forms of approval that depended entirely on the old persona remaining intact. Jung never promised individuation would make life simpler. He believed it made life more genuinely yours, which is a different and, in his view, considerably more important thing, even when it costs more than anyone tells you in advance that it will. There is one more dimension worth naming before this closes, because it addresses a question almost everyone eventually asks once they've come this far. How do you know the difference between authentic change and simply trading one persona for another? A new set of poses assembled to look like growth rather than actually representing it. Jung's answer to this was less a checklist than a felt quality. Genuine individuation tends to produce a specific kind of settledness, even amid external difficulty. A decreasing need for an audience to confirm the change is real. A persona replacing a persona still requires witnesses, still performs, still needs the approval it claims to have outgrown. Actual integration increasingly doesn't, not because the person no longer values connection, but because the validation it once required from outside has slowly, gradually, become available from somewhere much closer to home. Somewhere right now, someone is standing at the exact edge of this recognition, sensing, for the first time in years, the specific shape of a self they set aside a long time ago in exchange for being easier to love, easier to predict, easier to keep around. They do not yet know whether they'll walk toward it or quietly step back into the familiar costume, the way they have every other time this feeling surfaced before. Nobody can make that decision for them. It has always, from the very beginning, only ever been theirs to make.